when the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl, they had a parade, and I saw the debate online ahead of time about whether or not the city was going to grease the light poles. It's an odd practice, one you'd be fascinated to try and explain to somebody from a few hundred years ago. So many people show up to celebrate. Celebration inevitably gets out of hand, and the city puts grease on the light poles so people don't climb them, fall off, and get hurt. Uh, it's a wild thing. This is something you have to take into consideration, but there's such joy. I remember when I was 9 years old being in Cincinnati when the Cincinnati Reds won the National League, and everybody was downtown in Fountain Square, and it was just this huge party, and it was great. There were all these people, just thousands and thousands and thousands of people. They say that success has many parents, but failure is an orphan. Everybody wants to be a part of success. Everybody wants to show up and celebrate it. Nobody held a parade for the Bengals at the end of last year, or the year before that, or the one before that, or ever. Failure tends to isolate. Fear is like that too. The storms of life, they end up leaving us isolated. They leave us afraid. And our story today is about one of those storms. And it moves through fear, but it doesn't end there. In our reading from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been teaching all day. The sun begins to set, and Jesus invites them to go across to the other side. Many of the disciples, they're seasoned fishermen. They're accustomed to being on the water at night. It's so hot in the day that often they would fish at night. So they go out, another ordinary journey. They assume they're in control, just like we do on most days. Suddenly, in verse 37, everything changes. They're reminded how small they are, how vulnerable they are. Notice something else too. In verse 36, there's other boats with them. The disciples are not alone in this journey, but as the storm rages on, as the night grows deeper, the other boats aren't mentioned anymore. They're isolated from the community as they're tossed in the waves. Huge factor in life. It's what makes it so much harder, is not only do we struggle with storms, but then we're isolated. It's how life works. Disciples are listening to Jesus teach on a beautiful day. Next thing they know, they're in the middle of the sudden, uncontrollable storm. Jesus is asleep in the stern. They've given everything to follow him. They followed his commands, and here they find themselves overwhelmed by all of it. Do you know this feeling? Obviously, the last 4 years, we've gone from pandemics, political conflict, war, personal crises, economic struggles. It's exhausting, right? We were going along, we're following Jesus, and suddenly the dark of night obscures our hope in the path forward. So how do we live in faith when God may seem silent in the midst of the storm? And this is where I take comfort in the fear of the disciples. Last week, I talked about the illusion that it would all seem so much easier if we had been alive back then, if we had been one of the disciples. But then we read this story and we see how terrified the disciples are. They're seasoned fishermen. They've been through storms on the water, in the night probably before. But they were afraid. You would think, if they truly understood it all, that they would look at Jesus, this great teacher, this miracle worker, and they'd trust that it would all be okay. But instead, they looked at the storm, and they thought it was the end. Has fear ever done that to you? Has it snuck up on you, escalated, made you feel alone? Mark notes, those other boats that are around at the beginning of the story. But here in the big moment, there's no one else to be found. When a crisis hits, it feels like we're alone, like no one else can understand what we're going through. Think about some of the struggles I went through when I was a teenager. I assumed that nobody could understand exactly what I was going through. I didn't know how to talk about things. I certainly didn't know who would listen. I withdrew like so many of us do. And I wonder if that's what makes, everything we've gone through in the last 4 years so much harder, is that we as a culture, we're more isolated. We as a people, right? A lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that not as many people go to church anymore. And so the church doesn't exist to bind people together and to give people a sense of community. And so what is your community? And so if we're isolated, it makes those struggles so much harder. The disciples in our story, they were not calm in the midst of their fear. They woke Jesus, not with a gentle pat, but they went straight ahead to accusation. Don't you care that we are perishing? So they're afraid, and they assume that God has forgotten about them in the boat. They're utterly alone. and they think they're unnoticed by God. At this point, the story remarkably shifts. Jesus could rest in the face of the storm because Jesus has always been more powerful than the storm. Jesus has seen storms like this before. In Genesis 1, what does the Spirit move over? Watery chaos. In Psalm 107, the psalmist talks about God delivering sailors out of their distress, how the waves of the sea were hushed. In Job 38, God is telling Job that God laid the foundations of the earth and shut in the sea with its doors. God said to the waters, "Thus far you shall come, and no farther. Here shall your proud waves be stayed." Jesus remembers telling the sea that at the moment of creation, there is no question who is the master. Now, here in Mark 4, Jesus speaks to the waters with that same voice, the one that has creative power, with the same authority. Remember how the scribes were questioning Jesus' authority to forgive sins in our passage from last week? Jesus is showing the disciples the fullness of that authority now. The response shows that while they may have thought they understood Jesus, they didn't fully grasp the height of his authority. They have phobos mega, as it says in the Greek, great fear, reverent awe. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And they know Job 38. Their minds are trying to put together the pieces that the man in their boat laid the cornerstones of the earth. He is the Lord of creation itself. This is who they woke and said, "Don't you care that we are perishing?" The story gives us three important truths. First, fear is real, but Jesus is present. The disciples assumed that Jesus was absent in his sleep, uncaring about their fate and suffering. Fear was telling them that they were alone, that God didn't care. Faith in God remembers that Jesus is in the boat, that he cares for us. This is the Good Shepherd, watching over us even in our moments of fear. Or there's that little voice in your mind that will tell you that God is asleep, that God is not watching. But the Gospels are telling us that that is not true, that God is present. All right, so second, faith doesn't mean that we won't have fear. To be a Christian, it doesn't mean that you're never going to be afraid anymore, but we trust God in the midst of our fear. Jesus asks them why they're so afraid, why they don't have their faith. He asks them where their faith is. Get it out, put it on. Jesus doesn't rebuke them for feeling fear, but rather for letting fear guide their actions and lead them into this place of terror and accusation. They didn't believe that Jesus was greater than the storm. So third, the storm leads the disciples to a place of deeper faith. Jesus could have calmed the storm in the beginning, or before the disciples ever got into it, there could have been no storm. But they wouldn't have seen Jesus' true power over the elements. Their faith would not have been as deep. Sometimes we go through storms and we think that Jesus has abandoned us, but really we need to learn something about God in a way that we can't otherwise. Notice where the disciples are at the end of the story. They're still in the middle of the sea. They have this vivid memory of their fear, and they have a knowledge of who Jesus is. Also, they know the other boats are still out there. The same is true for us. Fear will come into your life. Fear will come into your heart. I can promise you that. My deepest prayer is that when you face it, you do so with the knowledge that Jesus cares for you, that he is there in the boat. And even if he seems silent to you, that Jesus is present, that Jesus is watching, and his power is greater than what you fear most. I promise you that this is true. Each of these disciples went to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus was who he said that he was, because they saw things like this. They experienced firsthand the power and authority of Jesus, and they wanted others to know about it, because this is the question that's in front of all of us, is Jesus who he says he is? And in the acts of Jesus, the demonstrations of his power and authority convinced the disciples, and they went forth a transformed people. And they wanted to be sure that the people in the other boats that were scattered by the same storm, that they heard the good news about the one who is more powerful than the storm, and the one who wants to bring them safely to harbor. So do not let your fear discourage your faith. Go to the one whose presence is with you, who has the power to bring you through the storm. Find a way to look for others who are in the same storm, who are isolated, who feel like their little boat is in grave danger of being swamped by all of the waves that we face. Share our journey. Share your story in the storm, how you found faith in someone greater than the storm. May we tie our rafts together in the midst of the sea and remind one another that God is greater than everything we will face. Let us be glad when the waters are quiet. Let us thank God for God's steadfast love and for God's wondrous works.